Tonight, we are stepping into a Victorian parlor. Heavy curtains, the faint scent of burning coal, and a fine mist of something else hanging in the air. Something herbal, chemical, perhaps a little addictive. Behind the prim smiles and stiff manners of the time, there was a secret world. A world where a cough could be treated with opium, a sleepless night soothed with laudanum, and a racing heart calmed with a dash of chloral hydrate. Welcome to the hidden, slightly absurd, and occasionally terrifying world of Victorian drug use. Most people think of the Victorians as stiff, proper, and entirely obsessed with morality. But behind those corsets and top hats, they were experimenting with substances in ways that would make a modern pharmacist clutch their pearls. Children were given opiates for colic. Housewives sipped on medicinal wine laced with cocaine. And doctors, with all the authority of science on their side, casually prescribed morphine like it was candy. It was a time when the line between medicine and mischief blurred so completely that nobody really noticed, until things went wrong, spectacularly wrong. Opium dens were not just the stuff of novels. They were real, smoky rooms in the heart of London, places where the curious, the wealthy, and the desperate went to escape the strict rules of society. Cocaine, once hailed as a miracle cure, could be found in tonics and toothache drops, proudly advertised as harmless, even beneficial. Meanwhile, patent medicines promised to cure everything from melancholy to female troubles, often with the side effect of quietly dulling your senses or sparking a mild addiction. It's easy to look back and laugh, or shudder, at these habits, but the Victorians were pioneers of modern drug culture, unknowingly crafting the rules and risks that we wrestle with today. Their world was part science, part magic, and entirely human, flawed, fascinating, and occasionally very funny in the darkest way. Over the next 14 chapters, we're going to explore this strange underworld. We'll peek into parlors, apothecaries, and dens, meet the doctors, patients, and socialites, and discover the bizarre ways a society obsessed with propriety navigated the allure of these substances. Each chapter will reveal a new layer of Victorian life, showing how the everyday and the extraordinary were bound together by curiosity, necessity, and a touch of reckless abandon. So, if you enjoyed dark humor, historical oddities, and tales that make you say, "Wait, they really did that?" you're in the right place. Subscribe to Boring Owl and turn on notifications, because the story of Victorian drugs is about to get stranger than fiction. And remember, this isn't just a history lesson. It's a journey into the quirks, contradictions, and secret indulgences of a society that looked proper but lived with chemicals whispering behind every curtain. Step into the world of Victorian medicine, where a visit to the doctor could feel like entering a theatrical performance, complete with glass bottles, powdered herbs, and a suspiciously cheerful apothecary behind the counter. Medicine, in the 19th century, was less about science as we know it, and more about authority, trust, and the occasional miracle or disaster. And at the heart of this strange ecosystem were substances we'd now recognize as dangerous, addictive, or outright illegal, but which were then considered perfectly normal remedies. Welcome to the world where laudanum, ether, and morphine were as ordinary as tea and biscuits. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was the superstar of Victorian medicine. It was prescribed for everything: colic in babies, anxiety in mothers, insomnia in the sleepless, and the occasional female hysteria, a diagnosis so flexible it could be applied to nearly any discomfort. Doctors handed it out liberally. Pharmacists measured it into tiny bottles with a practiced hand, and housewives administered it like a modern parent might dole out ibuprofen. The dark humor here isn't hard to spot. A baby sobbing from discomfort might be quietly sedated into peaceful sleep, while the family prided themselves on being caring and attentive. Accidental overdoses happened, of course, but in a society that trusted authority implicitly, these were often shrugged off as unfortunate miscalculations rather than a flaw in the system. Morphine arrived a little later, hailed as a wonder drug for pain and illness. Its introduction was part of a growing fascination with chemistry and pharmacology. Soldiers, returning from wars, found relief in morphine injections, and civilians quickly followed suit. Morphine was marketed as precise and modern, and yet, paradoxically, it was almost impossible to measure accurately at home. Addiction crept in slowly. A woman treating chronic pain for months could suddenly find herself dependent, though no one quite knew what dependent looked like until it was too late. Newspapers occasionally reported the tragedies, but the tone was often clinical, detached, almost apologetic. Society accepted that the same substance could be both miraculous and treacherous. It was simply part of the human condition. Ether and chloroform, anesthetics, now associated with surgery, were once also home remedies. An anxious mother might inhale a small amount to soothe nerves before childbirth, while the family doctor demonstrated its soothing properties in casual consultations. These chemicals offered a glimpse of escape, a temporary detachment from the constant pressures of Victorian life. But they also introduced new hazards. Overexposure could lead to unconsciousness or worse, yet the very novelty of feeling lightheaded or euphoric made it irresistible to many. The line between legitimate medical use and recreational indulgence was blurred almost by design, and few seemed inclined to question it. The apothecary's shop itself was a stage for this drama. Shelves lined with neatly labeled jars and bottles promised cures for every imaginable ailment. Cocaine appeared in tonics and toothache drops, proudly touted as invigorating or even curative. Herbs, minerals, and chemical concoctions were mixed with the same solemnity, yet with less certainty about their effects. The housewife trusted her pharmacist, the patient trusted the doctor, and in that trust, the potential for abuse quietly thrived. Every remedy was a gamble, but society had collectively decided that risk was part of progress. Perhaps the most curious aspect of Victorian medicine was its casual inclusion of children in this chemical culture. Babies were dosed with opiates for colic. Toddlers were given calming syrups to ensure peaceful sleep. Young girls were prescribed mild sedatives for nerves, a euphemism for any deviation from docile behavior. It was an era where medicine and social control intertwined, where the boundaries of care and coercion were often indistinguishable. The dark comedy here is subtle but unmistakable. A society that prized propriety and innocence was simultaneously drugging its young, all in the name of wellness. Doctors themselves were a mix of empiricism and flair. They measured, they observed, and they occasionally experimented, not in the lab, but in parlors and patient homes. Their authority was rarely questioned. A prescription was more than a suggestion. It was law, and families obeyed, sometimes with fatal consequences. But alongside tragedy, there was curiosity, ingenuity, and occasionally unintended hilarity. Stories abound of misread labels, mislabeled bottles, and the chaos of a household attempting to follow the precise dosing instructions of a chemist whose handwriting looked more like hieroglyphics than English. By the end of the 19th century, society was beginning to notice that this chemical playground was not without consequences. Addiction, accidental overdoses, and moral panic started creeping into newspapers and public discourse. Yet, for most of the Victorian era, the idea that a small tincture of opium could quietly shape your life, or even your death, was simply part of everyday existence. It was medicine, it was culture, and in its quiet, darkly humorous way, it was an essential component of life. So, as we move forward into the smoky opium dens, the fashionable parlors, and the home pharmacies of Victorian England, remember this: the substances themselves were not villains. They were tools, curiosities, and occasionally disasters. What made them remarkable was how society used them, trusted them, and sometimes abused them, all while maintaining the stiff upper lip that has become the enduring symbol of the era. Welcome to a world where the line between healing and indulgence was as thin as a measured drop of laudanum, and just as potent. The streets of London at night had a different heartbeat from the polite daytime city. Gas lamps flickered along cobblestones, casting long, quivering shadows on brick walls, and somewhere behind a heavy door, the scent of burning opium curled through the air like a silent invitation. Opium dens weren't hidden in some criminal underworld. They were part of the fabric of the city, tolerated, frequented, whispered about in the newspapers, yet oddly normalized. They were places where wealth, poverty, curiosity, and desperation all mingled in a haze of smoke and melancholy music. Entering a den was like stepping into another world. The rooms were low-ceilinged, filled with cushions and narrow divans, dimly lit so that the patrons' faces were partially obscured, half real, half myth. The air smelled sweet, pungent, and foreign, a combination that promised both escape and danger. Customers reclined lazily, their eyes heavy-lidded, their thoughts wandering in patterns shaped more by the drug than by anything external. Some came to forget sorrow, others to chase a fleeting sense of euphoria, and a few simply came to observe the peculiar rituals of the addicted. The lines between curiosity, necessity, and indulgence were never clear, and that ambiguity was part of the den's allure. Opium had a way of softening the harsh edges of life. Factory workers, exhausted from 12-hour shifts, could pay a few pennies and float into oblivion for a few hours. Artists and writers, seeking inspiration in altered consciousness, found themselves lost in clouds of imagination. Wealthy gentlemen, ostensibly upright and moral, would risk social censure to experience the gentle detachment it offered. It was democratic in a strange sense. Suffering, ambition, and desire all found a common denominator in the slow, opulent pull of the drug. Yet, like any indulgence, opium carried consequences. The line between occasional escape and dependency was remarkably thin. Many who entered the dens with curiosity or casual intent found themselves returning night after night, their lives quietly reshaped by the subtle seduction of the substance. Families might notice their loved ones becoming withdrawn or listless, but in a culture that prized discretion and propriety, public acknowledgement of addiction was rare. Private suffering was hidden behind curtained windows, as though shame itself could neutralize the chemical. The dens also existed as a kind of social theater. Proprietors were meticulous about presentation. Velvet cushions, polished pipes, aromatic oils, and sometimes music that floated languidly from hidden instruments. Patrons engaged in ritualized behavior, offering coins with care, lighting pipes with ceremony, and observing etiquette as though they were in a proper drawing room rather than a haze of smoke and opium. There was an odd humor in the scene, a self-conscious civility overlaying the chaotic intoxication beneath. It was serious business, and yet not serious at all, a contradiction the Victorians excelled at. Opium's presence in Victorian life extended far beyond the dens themselves. Medicinally, it was woven into households like a quiet, unspoken companion. Mothers might administer laudanum to soothe fussy children, husbands might sip opium-laced tonics to steady nerves, and the elderly could rely on it to ease the pain of arthritis or gout. It was a drug of intimacy and domesticity, a shadowy comfort that both healed and enslaved, depending on dosage and circumstance. In literature, opium symbolized escape, creativity, and danger all at once, mirroring the society that embraced it with cautious enthusiasm. The fascination with opium wasn't merely recreational, it was cultural, aesthetic, and philosophical. Writers like Thomas de Quincey, whose Confessions of an English Opium Eater documented the pleasures and perils of addiction, treated the substance as both muse and tormentor. Opium became shorthand for the exotic, the mysterious, and the morally ambiguous. Even for those who never touched a pipe, the idea of opium carried a potent allure, a door to altered perception, a gentle rebellion against the rigidity of daily life. Not all encounters with opium were as refined or controlled as literary musing suggested. Addiction could creep silently into a household, transforming a once spirited individual into a pale, listless figure, dependent on the bottle or pipe for the smallest relief. Social class influenced perception. A wealthy addict could maintain appearances, enjoying secret indulgences, while the working poor were more visible victims of circumstance and chemistry combined. Newspapers occasionally decried the growing problem, though reports were often sensationalized, painting a moral panic that was both accurate and exaggerated. Travelers, journalists, and social reformers all commented on opium dens with a mixture of horror and fascination. They were described as dens of vice, yet the stories always carried an air of romanticism, the idea that London harbored mysterious, hidden worlds accessible only to the curious and bold. For the Victorians themselves, the allure was partly escapism, partly novelty, and partly the subtle defiance of propriety. To recline on a cushion and inhale the swirling smoke was, in some ways, a quiet rebellion, an acknowledgement that the carefully maintained order of society could be bent, just for a little while, by the soft pull of a drug. Opium's influence also extended into commerce and politics. China, the primary source of raw opium, was a subject of trade and conflict. British imperial interests intertwined with the drug, adding another layer of complexity to its presence in everyday life. The Victorians were consumers of a global substance, their habits linked to distant lands and international economies, though most users remained blissfully unaware of the larger machinery supporting their indulgence. It was personal, domestic, and yet profoundly connected to the world beyond the city streets. By the end of the century, opium had earned a reputation as both miracle and menace. Den patrons, medical users, and casual experimenters had all experienced its dual nature. Society began to wrestle with regulation, with moral panic, and with the difficult question of how to reconcile the human desire for relief with the chemical realities of addiction. And yet, the fascination never entirely faded. Opium remained a symbol of escape, creativity, and danger, a chemical companion to a society obsessed with propriety, yet endlessly curious about transgression. In this smoky, dimly lit, velvet-cushioned world, life and indulgence were inseparable. Every inhaled puff, every careful dose, every secret indulgence was part of a delicate dance between pleasure and peril. The opium den, with its quiet rituals, heavy air, and subtle dangers, perfectly encapsulated the Victorian paradox, a society outwardly orderly, inwardly indulgent, and endlessly inventive in its ways of bending rules, escaping realities, and chasing fleeting moments of pleasure. The story of opium in Victorian England is a story of humanity itself, curious, fragile, and never entirely predictable. Cocaine arrived in Victorian society like a polite guest who overstayed their welcome, quietly at first, then impossible to ignore. Unlike opium, which had centuries of history and a certain romanticized aura, cocaine was new, flashy, and marketed as a modern marvel. It appeared in tonics, wines, and even lozenges, boasting claims of health, vitality, and mental sharpness. Doctors and pharmacists alike seemed enchanted, promoting it as harmless, even beneficial. Parents could give it to children for toothaches, socialites sipped it at cocktail parties, and writers lauded it as a stimulant for creative brilliance. It was medicine, leisure, and performance enhancer all at once, all wrapped in a thin veil of scientific respectability. The story of cocaine in Victorian life is almost absurd in hindsight. Here was a drug now notorious for its addictive and dangerous potential, casually handed out in medicine bottles with instructions like any ordinary remedy. Toothache lozenges could leave a child giddy and wide-eyed, while a mother might sip a tonic to lift her spirits or sharpen her wits for social engagements. Even among the upper classes, it became a fashionable indulgence, quietly reinforcing social hierarchies. The wealthy could experiment openly, the curious middle class imitated, and the poor largely remained unaware, though not unaffected by its wider circulation. Cocaine's rise was helped by clever marketing. Pharmacies displayed bottles prominently, with labels claiming miraculous effects: energy, improved digestion, relief from headaches, and even aid in overcoming fatigue. In the newspapers and journals of the time, doctors endorsed these products, citing case studies and anecdotal evidence as proof. Few questioned the claims because science was still an aspirational pursuit rather than a rigorous discipline. Trust in authority and expertise was absolute, and the Victorians, with their rigid faith in progress, eagerly believed in the promise of this crystalline stimulant. The social applications of cocaine were as curious as its medicinal ones. Young men visiting opulent clubs sometimes carried a small vial or lozenge for discreet consumption, while women, increasingly interested in health fads and tonics, might quietly experiment at home. Artists and writers were drawn to it as a muse, seeking heightened focus or imaginative leaps. The irony, of course, was that in seeking brilliance, many only found jitteriness, sleepless nights, and an unpredictable descent into dependency. Yet the cultural narrative emphasized adventure, vitality, and sophistication, rather than caution. Children were not spared, though. Toothache lozenges and cough syrups often contained enough cocaine to elicit noticeable effects. Victorian parents, more concerned with propriety and comfort than with long-term consequences, administered these remedies without a second thought. The humor, if one can call it that, is dark. The same society that prided itself on discipline and order routinely experimented with substances that could alter the very perception of reality, sometimes in its youngest members. Medical journals occasionally noted peculiar behaviors in children, but these were often dismissed as transient or minor rather than alarming. Cocaine's appeal also intersected with medicine and industry in unexpected ways. It was used to combat fatigue in railway workers, supposedly enhancing alertness and productivity. Surgeons experimented with local anesthesia, marveling at its ability to numb without full sedation. It seemed miraculous, and for a time, it was hard to find anyone willing to see the potential for abuse. The line between responsible use and dependency was, as with opium, remarkably thin. Society's fascination with progress and modernity blinded many to the slower, quieter consequences of widespread availability. And yet, for all its promise, cocaine introduced a subtle chaos. The Victorian preoccupation with respectability meant that indulgence was private, whispered about, or hidden in domestic routines. Secret consumption became a common motif. A gentleman savoring a lozenge in his study, a mother lifting her tonic glass behind a lace curtain, an artist mixing a pinch of powder into coffee before beginning a night of fevered creativity. There was a ritual, a drama, and an irony in every act. Society's strict moral codes coexisted with chemical rebellion, each reinforcing the other. The newspapers began to notice, eventually, though not before the substance had permeated multiple layers of life. Reports of nervousness, sleeplessness, and unaccountable behavior prompted the first faint murmurs of concern. Yet the tone remained cautious, reflective, almost apologetic. Cocaine was new, and novelty was difficult to condemn outright. The general public, meanwhile, oscillated between fascination and skepticism, drawn to the substance like moths to gaslight, unaware that fascination often bred addiction. Victorian culture itself contributed to the mythos of cocaine. Writers and journalists, even while warning of overuse, emphasized the mysterious, exotic, and stimulating nature of the drug. In salons, parlors, and private homes, it became part of a subtle display of sophistication. One might discreetly mention a tonic, a lozenge, or an experiment with modern remedies to convey intelligence, refinement, or adventurousness. Cocaine was less about intoxication than about appearance, perception, and the cultivated aura of progress and innovation. It's tempting to view this era's approach to cocaine as naive, almost laughably so, but the reality was more complex. It was a society navigating uncharted chemical territory, confident in its science, trusting in its authorities, and largely unaware of the slippery slope beneath. Dependency could begin quietly, almost invisibly, in homes, clinics, and social clubs. By the time concern reached the public consciousness, the substance had already etched itself into daily life, a paradoxical companion, miraculous for some, dangerous for others, and universally fascinating. Ultimately, cocaine in Victorian England was a microcosm of the age itself, an interplay of innovation, indulgence, and contradiction. It promised clarity, but often delivered chaos, offered stimulation, yet demanded discretion, and exemplified the tension between curiosity and caution that defined the era. Those who encountered it, whether as patients, parents, artists, or the merely curious, participated in a culture simultaneously bold and naive, scientific and theatrical, proper and indulgent. In the shadowy parlors and well-lit apothecaries of the time, the crystalline powder whispered the same eternal question: how far would you go for a taste of brilliance, even when brilliance came at a subtle cost? Laudanum was the quiet backbone of Victorian life, the subtle companion in nearly every household. It was so ubiquitous that its presence was barely noticed, woven into the routines of domesticity like sugar in tea. Mothers kept small bottles on the mantelpiece or in cabinet drawers, ready to soothe a crying baby, a nervous daughter, or an ailing husband. Apothecaries dispensed it freely, with little instruction beyond a casual "take as needed," and doctors recommended it with an authority that rarely admitted question. Its allure was simplicity itself. A few drops could calm, dull, or quiet almost any distress, and the promise of relief was irresistible in a society that prized order and composure above all else. For children, laudanum was practically an institution. Colicky infants were soothed with it, toddlers who would not sleep were gently sedated, and small illnesses were treated with measured doses, sometimes far too generous for the delicate physiology of youth. The Victorian household was an experiment in chemical management, often conducted without awareness of the consequences. Parents were guided by the prevailing wisdom that a quiet child was a healthy child, blissfully unaware that quiet often came from a subtle, insidious sedation. The humor in this is tragically dark. Children were being medicated for behavior that society simply did not want to accommodate, a chemical correction disguised as care. Women, too, were frequent recipients of laudanum. Anxiety, sleeplessness, menstrual pain, and the vague category of nerves could all be treated with a few drops of the opium tincture. In polite society, a calm, composed woman was a model of propriety, and laudanum ensured compliance with these unspoken social rules. Doctors, often male, wrote prescriptions with an air of scientific precision, yet the doses were flexible, left to the judgment of the patient or her household. In this context, laudanum functioned as a tool of both relief and control, smoothing the jagged edges of life while subtly reinforcing the rigid expectations of gender and behavior. The administration of laudanum was an art in itself. It could be mixed with wine, added to tea, or delivered directly in measured drops. Apothecaries were meticulous in their instructions, often leaving room for interpretation, and households developed their own rituals: a dropper in the morning for nerves, a spoonful at night for restful sleep. The boundaries between medicinal necessity and habitual indulgence were porous. Addiction, though not widely discussed, was a frequent consequence. Yet the social norms of discretion and propriety meant that few addressed dependency openly. It was easier to treat the symptoms and ignore the subtle decline of vitality or the quiet withdrawal of a once vibrant family member. Accidental overdoses occurred more often than the newspapers reported. Children could slip into unconsciousness, women could become lethargic or confused, and even men, supposed paragons of reason and restraint, could fall prey to misjudged doses. Yet, in a society that valued appearances above all, these tragedies were often hushed, explained away as unfortunate circumstances or inherent fragility. The dark irony was never far. The very remedies intended to sustain life and order could, when misused or misunderstood, threaten it. And yet, laudanum remained indispensable, a trusted solution for every conceivable domestic or personal ailment. Beyond the household, laudanum was intertwined with medicine, literature, and culture. Doctors relied on it for a range of conditions, from minor discomforts to severe illnesses, while writers and artists often experimented with it as a source of inspiration or altered consciousness. The tincture was emblematic of Victorian contradictions, scientifically praised, socially sanctioned, yet chemically potent and dangerously seductive. In literature, laudanum frequently appeared as a plot device, a symbol of mystery, melancholy, or moral ambiguity. Its cultural footprint was as significant as its medicinal utility, reflecting the pervasive influence of opium derivatives in everyday life. Victorian families approached laudanum with a mixture of trust, necessity, and ritual. It was administered with care, yet the potential for harm was always present. A mother might measure the drops precisely for a restless child. A daughter might self-administer to calm racing thoughts. And a father might use it discreetly to ease the stress of business or social obligations. Each use reinforced the quiet authority of chemistry in daily life, the subtle but persistent influence of drugs in shaping behavior, health, and domestic harmony. In many ways, laudanum exemplified the essence of Victorian life itself, orderly on the surface, meticulously managed, and outwardly civilized, yet underlain with a chemical chaos that few fully acknowledged. The domestic rituals surrounding its use revealed a society attempting to reconcile propriety with human frailty, control with comfort, and moral ideals with physiological realities. The drug's presence was omnipresent, but invisible, a silent actor in the theater of daily existence, shaping lives as much as it soothed them. As the century progressed, awareness of laudanum's addictive potential grew slowly, often after personal or public tragedies made the consequences undeniable. Society began to wrestle with questions of dosage, oversight, and regulation, though the deeply ingrained cultural trust in physicians and apothecaries slowed any rapid reform. Yet even as concern increased, laudanum retained its dual role as savior and seducer, a remedy, a crutch, and a subtle force in the everyday drama of Victorian existence. Its legacy, both domestic and cultural, illustrates the fragile boundary between care and dependency, relief and indulgence, and underscores the human tendency to embrace solutions that promise comfort, even when danger quietly lurks beneath. In homes across England, the dropper in the morning, the careful spoonful at night, the hidden bottle in a cabinet, all were reminders of a society negotiating its needs, desires, and anxieties through chemical means. Victorian life, so concerned with control and order, relied on laudanum as a quiet facilitator, a softening agent that made reality bearable. And in doing so, it shaped a culture, left its mark on countless families, and set the stage for future generations to confront the complex legacy of a society that medicated its children, its women, and itself in pursuit of calm, propriety, and the ever-elusive relief from the pressures of everyday life. Cannabis in Victorian England wasn't the rebellious symbol it would become in the 20th century. For most people, it was a curious, medicinal plant, quietly integrated into households and apothecaries. Doctors prescribed it in small doses for pain, digestive issues, and general discomfort, while some writers and artists experimented with it for inspiration or relaxation. It was rarely scandalous, rarely headline-making, and yet it carried an air of exoticism. The substance itself was part of the empire's global reach, imported from India and the colonies, a reminder that Britain's domestic life was subtly intertwined with distant lands. Cannabis tinctures were sold in pharmacies alongside laudanum, morphine, and opium. The bottles were carefully labeled with suggested doses, usually drops taken in water or wine, and instructions that were generous enough to invite experimentation. For Victorian families, cannabis was just another tool in the vast medicinal toolkit. A father might take a few drops for a headache after a long day at the office. A mother might use it to calm a restless child, or herself during moments of anxiety. The plant's effects were gentle, often unnoticed until someone experimented with larger amounts, leading to mild euphoria or a hazy sense of detachment from reality. Upper-class society was the primary playground for cannabis use. Social elites, with access to imported goods and an interest in the latest medical curiosities, sometimes used it recreationally under the guise of propriety. Gentlemen might quietly test a tincture during a late-night gathering, while ladies could experiment discreetly with a measured dose to calm nerves or insomnia. There was little stigma, in part because the drug's use was framed as scientific or medicinal, a way of showing sophistication and worldly knowledge rather than indulgence. The novelty, the exotic origin, and the subtle effects combined to make cannabis an attractive, socially acceptable diversion. For artists and writers, cannabis offered inspiration without the overt chaos associated with opium or cocaine. They experimented with tinctures or smoked preparations, seeking the gentle alteration of perception that might spark creativity or soften the rigid boundaries of Victorian life. Unlike the overt highs of other substances, cannabis was subtle, philosophical, and quietly intoxicating. It allowed a mind to wander, a perception to shift, without the dramatic collapse into addiction or overstimulation seen with other drugs. In this way, it was both medicinal and recreational, a bridge between the domestic routine and the private, imaginative escape. Children occasionally encountered cannabis as well, though in more controlled contexts. A tincture might be recommended for teething pain or minor ailments, always in very small doses. Unlike laudanum, cannabis rarely produced severe sedation, though it could leave a child drowsy or unusually calm. Parents trusted the pharmacist's guidance and the doctor's recommendation, administering drops with care, believing they were providing relief rather than risking long-term consequences. The dark humor of the era persists here. While children were quietly sedated with opium-laced remedies, cannabis offered a milder, almost philosophical reprieve from discomfort, a curious counterpoint in a household brimming with chemicals. Cannabis use in Victorian society was intertwined with colonial and global trade networks. India, the primary source of raw material, was part of the empire's vast supply chain, and the plant arrived in England as both a medicinal commodity and a symbol of the empire's reach. Its exotic origins gave it prestige, and its rarity made it socially interesting. The elite could claim sophistication simply by acknowledging its presence, while ordinary households used it with a practical focus on health and relief. In both cases, the plant quietly reinforced social hierarchies and cultural awareness, a reminder that even the most intimate aspects of domestic life were shaped by distant politics and commerce. Medical texts of the era treated cannabis seriously but cautiously. Doctors recommended it for pain, muscle spasms, insomnia, and anxiety, often as a secondary or alternative remedy to opiates. Dosages were carefully noted, and the subtle effects were praised as beneficial rather than dangerous. The medicalization of cannabis helped maintain its social acceptability, framing its use as rational, controlled, and entirely appropriate for Victorian sensibilities. Its cultural presence was reinforced by literature, with mentions in novels, essays, and personal diaries that highlighted both its novelty and its utility. Cannabis also played a role in gendered medicinal practices. Women, often considered more delicate or prone to nervous disorders, were given tinctures to calm the mind and ease discomfort. Gentlemen, in contrast, were encouraged to use it sparingly for fatigue or headache, reinforcing ideas of restraint and propriety. The plant's flexibility made it suitable for a society obsessed with appearances, a subtle tool for health, relaxation, and controlled indulgence, never overtly scandalous, but quietly influential. By the late Victorian period, cannabis had established itself as a quiet fixture in domestic and medical life. It was overshadowed by the more dramatic stories of opium, laudanum, and cocaine, yet its subtle presence shaped experiences, inspired creativity, and offered a gentle escape from the strictures of daily life. For households, it was just another remedy, part of the invisible infrastructure of health and comfort. For artists, writers, and curious socialites, it offered a rare window into altered consciousness without the overwhelming risk or social scrutiny of its more notorious chemical cousins. In a society obsessed with propriety, control, and outward appearances, cannabis was a gentle rebellion, a private indulgence that aligned with Victorian ideals while quietly bending dung. Its story intersects with medicine, culture, and empire, demonstrating how even small, carefully measured substances could leave a lasting mark on domestic life and social practice. For the Victorians, cannabis was not scandalous. It was simply useful, curious, and occasionally delightful, a whisper of freedom in a tightly structured world. And yet, as with all substances of the era, it existed in tension with other chemicals, other habits, and other societal pressures. Cannabis was rarely the villain, rarely the crisis, but its subtle influence shaped perceptions, behaviors, and even creative output, leaving an indelible fingerprint on a society that quietly embraced both propriety and experimentation. In its gentle effects, in its exotic allure, and in its quiet domestic presence, cannabis represents one more layer of the complex, contradictory, and endlessly fascinating story of Victorian drugs. Victorian households were filled with shelves of bottles, jars, and tins, each promising relief, vitality, or even miraculous cures. Patent medicines were everywhere, lining the counters of apothecaries, decorating the cabinets of homes, and enticing the curious with colorful labels and bold claims. They were marketed as solutions to every conceivable problem: headaches, melancholy, fatigue, female troubles, and even more vague maladies like general debility. Some contained nothing more potent than herbs and sugar, but many hid secret ingredients that, by modern standards, would be considered alarming: opium, cocaine, alcohol, and other psychoactive substances lurking beneath reassuring labels. The Victorian consumer was both trusting and curious. Apothecaries presented their wares with an air of authority, each bottle meticulously labeled and packaged, a small guarantee of efficacy and propriety. Newspapers and pamphlets carried testimonials, sometimes scientific, often anecdotal, extolling the virtues of these miraculous elixirs. The social contract was simple: trust the medicine, trust the authority, and in return, enjoy the promise of improved health, energy, or mood. The irony, of course, was that trust often exceeded knowledge, leaving consumers vulnerable to dependency, overdoses, and the slow creep of addiction. Some patent medicines were sold openly in shops with colorful signage. Others advertised in magazines and journals, promising relief to anyone who dared to follow the instructions. Labels were bold, colorful, and often wildly exaggerated, claiming that a single bottle could cure ailments ranging from toothaches to chronic fatigue, from female weakness to melancholy. The effect was as much psychological as chemical. People believed they were being healed, and belief itself carried a placebo power that reinforced the authority of the apothecary and the supposed effectiveness of the medicine. Opium and cocaine were common ingredients, often undisclosed. Laudanum, morphine, or small amounts of cocaine were mixed into tonics and elixirs, creating a sense of calm, euphoria, or stimulation, depending on the formula. The average household might administer these remedies daily, never questioning the subtle ways the chemicals shaped moods, energy levels, and behavior. The line between health and indulgence blurred, and yet the bottles were considered essential, not dangerous. They were part of life, part of routine, and part of the illusion of modern medicine. Women were frequent consumers of patent medicines, often for what doctors called nervous disorders or female troubles. These categories were flexible, and a cough, sleeplessness, or general irritation could all be treated with the same tincture. Society expected women to maintain composure, calm, and beauty, and patent medicines offered a chemical aid in performing these social roles. Gentle sedatives, opiate-laced tonics, and mild stimulants became tools in the daily performance of propriety, enabling women to navigate a society that demanded both resilience and restraint. Men were not exempt either. Industrial workers, businessmen, and professionals relied on tonics to maintain energy, alertness, and productivity. A few drops of cocaine or a small sip of a stimulating elixir could make the difference between enduring the day and collapsing under the weight of labor, stress, or social expectation. The promise of improvement was irresistible, and the subtle chemical reinforcement was almost secondary to the belief in efficacy. Here, as in other aspects of Victorian life, perception was as potent as reality. Patent medicines also catered to children. Parents, trusting in the expertise of pharmacists and the authority of doctors, administered tonics for colic, teething pain, or general irritability. The doses were often generous, and the effects, sometimes sedative, sometimes stimulating, went largely unquestioned. In hindsight, the humor is dark. Households carefully measured chemicals for their children, believing in their restorative power, while the same substances had the potential to shape development, behavior, and health in ways only later understood. Marketing played a key role in the popularity of these medicines. Elaborate illustrations, exotic names, and grandiose claims created a sense of wonder and necessity. Some were branded as imported from distant lands, lending prestige and mystery, while others boasted endorsements from supposed medical authorities. The message was clear. Modern science had delivered a solution to every ailment, and with the right bottle, any household could harness this knowledge. Consumers were invited to participate in the act of modernity, to perform progress through careful, regular use of chemical remedies. Yet, behind the color and ceremony lay a quieter, darker reality. Overdose, dependency, and subtle addiction were common, though rarely discussed openly. Victorians accepted risk as a part of life, trusting that proper care, discretion, and authority would mitigate danger. When tragedy occurred, it was often framed as misfortune or miscalculation, rather than a systemic flaw in the practice of medicine or the commercialization of chemical remedies. The settled danger was invisible, and yet it permeated homes, shaping lives in ways both immediate and lasting. Some patent medicines became notorious for their addictive qualities, while others were celebrated for their calming effects or restorative powers. Families relied on them, passed them down from generation to generation, and incorporated them into the rhythm of domestic life. Apothecaries advised on dosages with a careful hand, sometimes precise, often suggestive, leaving room for interpretation that could lead to habit, reliance, or unintended intoxication. In this sense, the bottles themselves were more than medicine. They were instruments of control, comfort, and, occasionally, quiet rebellion. The story of patent medicines is inseparable from the broader culture of chemical indulgence in Victorian England. The era was defined by exploration, innovation, and curiosity, and substances that promised improvement or relief were naturally embraced. Families, doctors, and pharmacists participated in a tacit social contract: trust the authority, use the remedies, and maintain appearances. This framework allowed chemical consumption to flourish, even as its risks grew, illustrating the tension between trust, necessity, and the seductive power of promise. By the end of the century, patent medicines had become both a cultural symbol and a cautionary tale. They reflected the aspirations, fears, and contradictions of a society navigating modernity, trust, and human desire. They were instruments of comfort, status, and control, yet they were also chemical companions that quietly shaped behavior, perception, and health. In every household, from the humblest to the grandest, these bottles represented the intertwining of authority, belief, and the subtle intoxications of everyday life. In the end, patent medicines exemplify the essence of Victorian chemical culture, a mixture of hope, curiosity, authority, and risk, delivered in bottles as ordinary as tea, yet as potent as any opium pipe or cocaine tonic. They were trusted, celebrated, and quietly feared, a reflection of a society that both relied on and underestimated the substances it so casually embraced. Every dose told a story. Every bottle carried a paradox, and every household participated in the delicate dance between relief and dependency, authority and indulgence, health and hazard. Alcohol in Victorian England was a strange and contradictory companion. On the one hand, it was celebrated, woven into social rituals, and prescribed as medicine. On the other, it was feared, blamed for crime, poverty, and moral decay. Gin, wine, and fortified spirits flowed through households, parlors, and pubs alike, while society debated endlessly over temperance, morality, and moderation. What made Victorian alcohol culture particularly curious was its duality. It was both indulgence and prescription, pleasure and control, social lubricant and chemical crutch. For the middle and upper classes, alcohol was as domestic as a cup of tea. Port, sherry, and brandy were commonly found on sideboards, often labeled as medicinal or tonic. A glass of wine before dinner might calm nerves, stimulate appetite, or aid digestion, while a dram of brandy could be offered to a recovering patient, child, or weary spouse. In polite society, alcohol's effects were subtle, measured, and socially sanctioned. Drinking in moderation was a sign of refinement, while overindulgence was quietly condemned, but often tolerated if hidden behind closed doors. The temperance movement, gaining momentum in the mid-19th century, complicated the cultural picture. Reformers argued that alcohol was the root of societal ills, targeting gin shops, pubs, and working-class habits as breeding grounds for poverty, crime, and disorder. Middle-class families were caught in a moral tug-of-war. They drank for comfort, tradition, and health, yet were expected to set an example of restraint. The rhetoric of temperance emphasized responsibility, self-control, and moral superiority, yet few could resist the appeal of a restorative toddy on a winter's evening. Alcohol's medicinal role was both practical and absurd. Doctors prescribed wine, brandy, or spirits to stimulate appetite, aid digestion, or soothe the nerves. Pregnant women might be offered port to strengthen themselves. The sick were given whiskey to maintain strength. Children could receive a small dose of brandy in tonic for colic or discomfort. In households where laudanum and other opiates were already present, alcohol was just another chemical in the domestic arsenal, a familiar companion to the subtle sedations and stimulations of daily life. The humor, if dark, is easy to see. A society obsessed with order and propriety frequently administered intoxicants to the very people it claimed to protect, all under the guise of health and morality. Working-class habits around alcohol were more visible and controversial. Gin shops and taverns were often the center of social life, offering warmth, camaraderie, and temporary escape from the harsh realities of labor, poverty, and domestic struggle. Newspapers and reformers sensationalized these habits, describing drunkenness as a moral failing, a social menace, and a threat to civilization. The rhetoric often ignored the context. Long hours, poor nutrition, and limited leisure made alcohol an accessible and sometimes necessary form of relief. In this sense, drinking was both practical and symbolic, a way to cope, connect, and assert identity within the rigid social structures of Victorian life. Temperance campaigns also targeted women in particular. Women's alcohol consumption was framed as both a symptom and a cause of social instability. A woman who drank was portrayed as neglectful, morally suspect, or a threat to domestic harmony. Yet in many households, women secretly administered small doses of alcohol to calm nerves, soothe pain, or manage children's behavior. The contradiction is stark. Society demanded restraint and propriety, while chemical indulgence quietly ensured compliance with those very standards. Alcohol became both a tool of control and a private rebellion, a chemical agent mediating the tension between expectation and reality. Victorian literature reflects these tensions. Novels and plays frequently depict alcohol as a moral and social symbol, a source of humor, tragedy, or revelation. Characters might sip brandy in solitude to confront despair, toast success in parlor gatherings, or stumble through moral lessons shaped by excessive indulgence. The subtle humor and social commentary reveal that alcohol was more than a beverage. It was a narrative device, a lens through which society examined its contradictions, indulgences, and fears. Alcohol's intersection with other substances added further complexity. Many tonics, Patent medicines and elixirs contained alcohol as a base, blending medicinal and recreational purposes. Laudanum, cocaine tonics, and opium-based remedies were often alcohol-laden, compounding effects and blurring distinctions between therapy and indulgence. In a household, a single evening could involve a delicate balance of wine, brandy, laudanum, and other tonics, each chosen for specific effect or convenience, each contributing to a chemical choreography that few outside the family fully understood. Social gatherings, too, were infused with alcohol's duality. Cocktail parties, formal dinners, and informal parlor visits offered opportunities to demonstrate taste, sophistication, and restraint. Yet the same gatherings also provided a subtle chemical escape, a way to navigate stress, boredom, or emotional strain. Alcohol's effects were carefully monitored in public, but its private consumption revealed a culture comfortable with quiet indulgence, even as it publicly extolled temperance and moderation. By the end of the century, the conversation around alcohol was increasingly polarized. Reformers pushed for restriction, households debated morality versus utility, and the working class navigated both scarcity and social judgment. Yet, for all the public concern, alcohol remained an inseparable part of Victorian life, a chemical companion, a social lubricant, and a domestic necessity. Its presence illustrates the contradictions of the era, the tension between indulgence and propriety, and the subtle ways chemical consumption shaped everyday experience. Ultimately, Victorian alcohol culture was a study in duality. It healed and harmed, soothed and stimulated, celebrated and condemned. It was medicine and pleasure, tradition and rebellion, private indulgence and public concern. Gin shops, parlors, and apothecaries all participated in this complex dance, blending social expectation with chemical reality, moral aspiration with human desire. For the Victorians, alcohol was never just a drink. It was a tool, a symbol, and a quietly pervasive presence in every facet of life. And in that pervasive presence, one can see the essence of the era itself, structured yet indulgent, moral yet indulgent, rigid yet curious, and always balancing the fine line between propriety and pleasure. Victorian alcohol culture, with its contradictions, rituals, and hidden indulgences, offers a window into the chemical, social, and moral heartbeat of a society navigating the pressures, pleasures, and paradoxes of everyday existence. Chloroform arrived in Victorian England with the promise of progress, efficiency, and a peculiar kind of theatricality. It was lauded as a modern marvel, a chemical that could render a patient unconscious and allow surgeons to operate without pain. A miraculous invention that blurred the line between science and spectacle. Yet chloroform's use quickly extended beyond the operating theater, infiltrating parlors, homes, and the intimate routines of domestic life, often in ways the inventors never intended. Childbirth, long an ordeal steeped in fear, endurance, and whispered prayers, became one of the most common applications of chloroform outside hospitals. Doctors advocated for its careful administration to ease the pains of labor, and in many households, the practice was celebrated as a triumph of human ingenuity over suffering. Women, previously required to endure hours of contractions with little relief beyond moral fortitude, were suddenly offered a chemical reprieve. The subtle humor is dark. Society praised maternal strength and stoicism, while simultaneously providing a potent chemical that rendered that very strength almost irrelevant. Chloroform became a paradoxical tool, liberating and controlling at the same time. The mechanics of chloroform administration were deceptively simple. A cloth or handkerchief, dampened with the chemical, was held to the patient's face, and inhalation brought a gentle, immediate unconsciousness. Dosage was critical. Too little, and the pain persisted. Too much, and the consequences could be fatal. Victorian physicians, proud of their scientific rigor, navigated this narrow margin with care, though accidents did occur. Yet, society largely accepted the risk, fascinated by the promise of pain-free procedures and dazzled by the authority of the medical professional. It was both an act of faith and an experiment in chemical control. Beyond childbirth, chloroform found its way into social rituals and experimental indulgence. Curious gentlemen, artists, and physicians sometimes tested it recreationally, inhaling small doses to experience the brief detachment it offered from reality. Parlors became impromptu laboratories, where chemical curiosity mingled with performance, propriety, and social daring. Women, too, occasionally encountered it outside medical necessity, often under the supervision or suggestion of trusted family members or physicians. The novelty, secrecy, and subtle euphoria made chloroform a quietly thrilling, socially acceptable indulgence in an era obsessed with self-control. Chloroform's cultural impact extended beyond domestic life. Literature, newspapers, and medical journals commented on its properties, its promise, and its dangers. Authors used it as a narrative device, symbolizing liberation, vulnerability, or impending tragedy. It became emblematic of Victorian fascination with the fine line between control and chaos, science and spectacle, life and chemical intervention. The chemical itself was neutral, yet society imbued it with meaning, fascination, and occasionally fear. In households, chloroform was sometimes administered for non-surgical purposes. Women suffering from severe headaches, insomnia, or nervous disorders could be given a brief inhalation, providing temporary relief from discomfort. Children, though more cautiously treated, occasionally encountered it for extreme distress or illness. Families, trusting the expertise of the physician, embraced these interventions, rarely questioning the chemical's subtle influence on consciousness, behavior, or long-term health. The subtle irony is unmistakable. An era obsessed with moral discipline and propriety routinely employed a substance that obliterated awareness and temporarily suspended personal agency. The dangers of chloroform were well documented, though often downplayed. Overdose could lead to respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, or death, and Victorian medical texts included careful instructions for use and warnings about risks. Yet the fascination with novelty, the desire to alleviate suffering, and the trust in professional authority frequently overshadowed caution. Accidents did occur, sometimes with fatal consequences, but they were framed as unfortunate anomalies rather than a reflection of systemic overconfidence in chemical intervention. The tension between hope, authority, and risk defined chloroform's role in Victorian life. Chloroform also intersected with issues of social class, gender, and propriety. Upper-class households could access physicians skilled in its administration, ensuring both safety and social respectability. Working-class families, in contrast, often lacked access to professional oversight, leading to more experimental, risk-prone use. Women of all classes were expected to endure suffering with composure, yet chloroform allowed a rare, socially sanctioned escape from pain. Its use reinforced gendered notions of care, control, and societal expectation, while simultaneously offering a private rebellion against the demands of endurance. The theatricality of chloroform administration was another defining feature. In surgical theaters, laboratories, or private homes, the chemical created moments of heightened drama, a stage-like spectacle in which life, death, and consciousness hung delicately in balance. Observers watched, fascinated, often simultaneously horrified and entranced. It was a chemical performance with real stakes, and the participants, whether patient, physician, or witness, became actors in a subtle, dangerous drama. Victorian fascination with spectacle, science, and human vulnerability converged in these moments, revealing much about the era's values, curiosities, and anxieties. By the end of the century, chloroform had established a dual reputation, celebrated for its medical benefits, particularly in obstetrics, and feared for its lethal potential. Society grappled with its promise and peril, balancing the desire for relief, curiosity, and spectacle against the sobering reality of chemical risk. Its presence in households, medical practice, and literature reflects the Victorian obsession with control, innovation, and moral performance, illustrating the delicate tension between progress and hubris. In the intimate spaces of domestic life, chloroform was a tool, a marvel, and a subtle agent of transformation. It offered relief, pleasure, and sometimes terror, reshaping experiences of pain, suffering, and consciousness. It exemplified the contradictions of Victorian chemical culture: practical yet theatrical, liberating yet controlling, scientific yet mysterious. Every inhalation, every careful application, and every whispered anecdote contributed to the era's intricate dance between propriety, indulgence, and the subtle seductions of chemistry. Chloroform, with its quiet power and dangerous potential, became emblematic of the Victorian approach to drugs: pragmatic, curious, morally complex, and endlessly fascinating. In its use, society confronted fundamental questions about control, risk, pleasure, and authority, negotiating a precarious balance between scientific progress and human vulnerability. It was a chemical that demanded attention, respect, and a careful hand, reflecting the era's obsession with mastery over both the body and experience itself. And in that balance, one sees the essence of Victorian life: structured yet indulgent, disciplined yet curious, moral yet experimental, and always walking the tightrope between the promise of progress and the ever-present shadow of consequence. Chloroform, like other substances of the era, quietly shaped households, social rituals, and cultural imagination, leaving a lasting imprint on a society navigating the complex intersection of chemistry, authority, and human desire. The late Victorian fascination with chemicals extended into the realm of stimulants, far beyond cocaine and caffeine, introducing society to a subtle, pervasive friend: strychnine. Today, the name evokes poison, danger, and murder mysteries. But in Victorian England, it was prescribed, dosed, and consumed as a tonic, a stimulant, and occasionally even a mild pick-me-up. Its dual identity as both medicine and potential hazard made it emblematic of an era simultaneously obsessed with progress, propriety, and chemical curiosity. Strychnine appeared in patent medicines, tonics, and elixirs, often in microscopic doses that promised invigoration without immediate harm. Physicians recommended it for fatigue, low energy, and general malaise, portraying it as a safe stimulant to restore vitality. Housewives might administer it to weary husbands returning from long hours of labor or business, while young men seeking endurance or alertness might find it in discreet bottles labeled with medical authority. The irony is darkly comedic. A substance capable of violent toxicity in high doses was embraced in home life as a gentle enhancer, trusted to nudge energy, mood, or productivity without visible consequence. The Victorian mindset made strychnine's popularity understandable. Life demanded stamina, order, and relentless productivity. Long work hours, social obligations, and domestic responsibilities created a culture that prized chemical assistance, so long as it remained invisible and controlled. Strychnine, taken in tiny amounts, appeared to fit this ideal perfectly. It was subtle, efficient, and socially acceptable, its effects largely psychological as much as physiological, a chemical promise of energy in a society that prized controlled exertion. Medical guides of the period treated strychnine as both an opportunity and a responsibility. Doctors carefully noted dosages, emphasizing caution and vigilance, yet the tolerance for experimentation was remarkably high. Patients and families often followed instructions loosely, measuring drops with a casual hand or incorporating tonics into daily routines. The distinction between therapeutic use and habit was hazy, a thin line easily crossed without obvious consequences, until, of course, it was not. This ambiguity is a recurring theme in Victorian chemical culture. Substances were both miracle and menace, relied upon daily, yet capable of subtle, accumulating danger. For children, strychnine was occasionally recommended in tiny doses to stimulate appetite, counteract weakness, or encourage growth. The results were unpredictable. A child might exhibit heightened alertness and energy, or, in rare instances, display nervous twitching, irritability, or distress. Parents trusted apothecaries and doctors, often unaware of the narrow margin between gentle stimulation and harm. The scene is grimly humorous. Families carefully administering a substance that in excess could kill, all while celebrating its supposed restorative properties. It was a perfect illustration of Victorian faith in authority, science, and chemical optimism. Strychnine's presence was not limited to households. Soldiers, laborers, and explorers occasionally relied on it for stamina, endurance, or to counter exhaustion. Victorian military manuals sometimes included its use as a stimulant during arduous campaigns, while industrial workers might encounter it in tonics sold as energy boosters. The chemical thus became both a domestic companion and a tool of productivity, threading its way through private, professional, and even imperial spheres of life. Its subtle power reinforced society's obsession with control over the body, control over energy, and control over human capacity for work and endurance. The cultural perception of strychnine also reflected Victorian attitudes toward danger and novelty. Unlike opium or cocaine, which carried associations of exotic indulgence, strychnine was framed as a scientific marvel, an opportunity to harness nature's power for practical ends. It was clean, efficient, and ostensibly rational, a stimulant to be trusted, measured, and respected. Yet the public fascination with its potential hazards added a layer of thrill. The very knowledge that the substance could kill in excess lent it an air of sophistication, a subtle gamble between life, energy, and death. Literature, newspapers, and medical journals documented its use with a mix of admiration and caution. Novels might reference the careful administration of tonics containing strychnine, while medical guides emphasized both the restorative promise and the narrow margin of safety. The chemical became emblematic of the era's contradictory impulses: fascination with novelty, desire for improvement, and an almost casual willingness to flirt with danger, all within the bounds of propriety and authority. It was science and theater, health and risk, all mixed in a tiny, colorless drop. Strychnine's role in Victorian society also highlighted social and economic distinctions. The wealthy had access to high-quality, carefully measured preparations, while the working class might receive tonics of uncertain concentration. The elite could experiment with taste, dose, and timing, integrating the stimulant into a lifestyle of leisure and productivity, whereas laborers relied on it more out of necessity, sometimes facing inadvertent overuse or inconsistent dosing. Chemical consumption, even of something as ostensibly clinical as strychnine, reinforced social hierarchies, subtly shaping experience, health, and behavior across class lines. In domestic life, strychnine was part of a broader chemical orchestra. It complemented other stimulants, sedatives, and tonics: cocaine for alertness, laudanum for calm, wine for relaxation. Families orchestrated careful regimens, administering doses in measured succession, believing they were optimizing life, health, and comfort. The choreography was delicate: a teaspoon of tonic here, a drop of stimulant there, a hint of sedative later in the day. To outsiders, it might appear chaotic or dangerous, but to Victorian families, it was an accepted routine, a private mastery of chemistry, health, and domestic performance. By the late Victorian period, the limitations of strychnine became clearer. Cases of overdose, nervous agitation, or idiosyncratic reactions reminded physicians and families alike that chemical assistance was never entirely predictable. Yet the lessons were often framed as cautionary tales rather than prohibitions. The culture of experimentation persisted, as did the faith in expert guidance, controlled risk, and subtle indulgence. Strychnine remained an emblem of Victorian chemical culture, an elegant, dangerous, and invisible companion to everyday life. Ultimately, the story of strychnine illustrates a broader truth about Victorian drugs. They were rarely simple, rarely benign, and never fully controllable. They were integrated into households, workplaces, and social life with confidence and curiosity, shaping perception, behavior, and culture. Strychnine, in its quiet potency, exemplifies the era's fascination with chemistry, authority, and human limitation, a substance simultaneously celebrated, feared, and trusted, offering a brief taste of vitality while reminding its users of the ever-present shadow of danger. In the domestic, professional, and social spheres of Victorian England, strychnine quietly reinforced the contradictions of the era. It was practical, yet risky, trusted, yet thrilling, medicinal, yet indulgent. Every drop told a story of ambition, curiosity, and control, weaving itself into the intricate fabric of daily life. And like all Victorian chemicals, it revealed as much about society as it did about the body, the hopes, anxieties, and paradoxical pleasures of a civilization both disciplined and experimental, meticulous yet indulgent, fascinated with the promise and peril of the substances it so carefully administered. The Victorians were a society obsessed with control over morality, over behavior, over appearances, and increasingly over the body itself. Into this world of meticulous order and chemical curiosity arrived another, more subtle stimulant, caffeine. Today, we think of it as innocuous, a simple jolt of energy in tea, coffee, or chocolate. But in the 19th century, caffeine occupied a curious intersection between medicine, social ritual, and mild chemical dependency, weaving its way through households, parlors, and even the bustling streets of London with a quiet, pervasive influence. Tea, coffee, and chocolate were everywhere, from the simplest homes to the grandest estates. Afternoon tea had become a social institution, an opportunity to demonstrate refinement, taste, and proper conduct. Tea leaves, carefully imported from India and Ceylon, were steeped and served with precise ritual, measured water, correct steeping times, delicate porcelain cups. Coffee, increasingly popular among professionals, offered alertness for long hours of study or labor. Chocolate, less common but luxurious, provided warmth, sweetness, and a gentle stimulant for those who could afford it. In each case, caffeine was consumed not merely for pleasure, but as part of a broader system of domestic order, social propriety, and mental discipline. Yet caffeine was not always benign. Victorian medical guides often recommended it for headaches, lethargy, or digestive complaints, framing its stimulating properties as a therapeutic advantage. Doctors prescribed coffee, tea, or cocoa in measured doses, particularly for children, the sick, or the weak, emphasizing moderation while extolling efficacy. Parents administered cups of warm tea to soothe a restless child or bolster a fainting mother, trusting in the wisdom of authority. The humor is subtle and dark. A society so concerned with propriety, composure, and moral rectitude relied on a stimulant to maintain the very virtues it celebrated. The culture of caffeine extended into the working class, where tea and coffee served practical and social functions. Factory workers, clerks, and laborers consumed the beverages to sustain long hours, increase alertness, or simply survive the monotony of repetitive labor. Tea houses and coffee shops became spaces of temporary reprieve, places to exchange news, gossip, and small comforts while fortified with a mild chemical companion. The stimulant's effects were subtle yet reliable: heightened energy, improved focus, and an ability to endure the drudgery of Victorian life. It was a social lubricant, a domestic tool, and a mild chemical ally in one. Children, too, were exposed to caffeine, often unknowingly. Cocoa mixed with sugar and milk, sometimes enhanced with small amounts of coffee, was considered both nourishing and restorative. Victorian parents believed it strengthened the body and improved mood, unaware that repeated exposure could cultivate subtle dependency or altered sleep patterns. The combination of sweetness, warmth, and chemical stimulation ensured that children associated pleasure and comfort with the mild drug, a quiet initiation into the culture of domestic consumption. Caffeine's appeal extended to the intellectual and creative classes. Writers, students, and artists relied on coffee or tea to sustain long nights of study, composition, or artistic endeavor. The beverage provided clarity, focus, and endurance, fostering productivity and stimulating conversation. Salons and literary gatherings often revolved around the ritual of pouring, sipping, and discussing, while the chemical properties of caffeine quietly augmented attention and engagement. In this way, caffeine bridged domestic comfort, social ritual, and creative ambition, seamlessly integrating chemical stimulation into cultural life. The global dimensions of caffeine were also significant. The tea trade, intimately linked with British colonial ventures in India, Ceylon, and China, represented both economic power and cultural influence. Coffee, often imported from the Caribbean or South America, carried similar associations of trade, commerce, and exotic allure. Chocolate, derived from cocoa beans sourced from colonies, contributed to a sense of luxury and sophistication. Each caffeinated product was thus embedded in broader narratives of empire, commerce, and social aspiration, reinforcing class distinctions and global hierarchies even as it delivered a modest chemical boost. The Victorian obsession with measurement, moderation, and ritual meant that caffeine was rarely consumed haphazardly. Teas were brewed precisely, coffees measured carefully, and chocolate drinks prepared with attention to consistency. The effects of caffeine were subtle, predictable, and socially acceptable, reinforcing notions of self-control, refinement, and civilized habit. It was a stimulant that aligned with Victorian ideals, enhancing productivity, maintaining composure, and subtly regulating energy without dramatic consequences or scandal. Yet, caffeine also had a shadow side. Excessive consumption could produce irritability, sleeplessness, or nervousness. Combined with other stimulants, cocaine, strychnine, or patent tonics, it could amplify effects unpredictably. The carefully managed domestic chemistry of Victorian households sometimes faltered, leading to subtle disturbances in mood, behavior, or health. And while caffeine was rarely fatal, its pervasive presence exemplified the era's comfort with mild chemical intervention as a routine part of life. Cultural depictions of caffeine reflect both admiration and subtle critique. Literature, diaries, and newspapers mention tea, coffee, and chocolate not merely as beverages, but as symbols of habit, order, and social performance. Afternoon tea could illustrate refinement, alertness could signify intellect, and a well-prepared cup of cocoa could signal care and propriety in domestic life. Caffeine consumption was thus as much about social messaging as physiological effect, quietly reinforcing norms, behaviors, and expectations across gender, class, and domestic space. The widespread acceptance of caffeine also highlights Victorian priorities: efficiency, endurance, and composure. It was a stimulant that aligned with the demands of industrial and domestic life, enabling long workdays, attentive study, and polite conversation. Its presence was normalized, integrated into daily routines, and rarely questioned, a quiet chemical underpinning of social and cultural performance. By the end of the century, caffeine had firmly established itself as a mundane yet indispensable part of Victorian existence. Its subtle effects reinforced discipline, supported productivity, and facilitated social rituals, making it an unremarkable but pervasive presence. Unlike opium or cocaine, it rarely scandalized. Unlike strychnine or chloroform, it rarely threatened life. Yet its quiet influence on behavior, mood, and cultural practice demonstrates that even the mildest chemicals were deeply intertwined with the rhythms of Victorian life. Ultimately, caffeine in Victorian England exemplifies the era's integration of chemistry, routine, and social expectation. It was a stimulant that upheld order, supported ambition, and maintained appearances, offering gentle energy while quietly shaping domestic, professional, and social experience. In every teacup, coffee mug, and chocolate drink, one finds a microcosm of Victorian values: control, ritual, indulgence, and subtle chemical intervention. The world may have considered it harmless, even comforting, but it quietly participated in the complex choreography of Victorian life, a chemical whisper threading its way through every corner of daily existence. By the late Victorian era, laudanum, that notorious opium-based elixir, had become both a household staple and a cultural paradox. It was everywhere, in medicine cabinets, apothecary bottles, and even tucked away in small tins on bedside tables. Laudanum was praised for its ability to calm, soothe, and alleviate pain, yet simultaneously criticized for its potential to seduce the unwary into dependency. Its ubiquity made it ordinary, even mundane, while its effects remained potent, subtle, and sometimes dangerously invisible. Households treated laudanum as a kind of domestic Swiss Army knife, a solution for colic, teething pain, insomnia, nervous disorders, and even melancholy. Parents administered it to children with a mixture of trust and convenience, often without fully understanding the drug's potency. A few drops in water or syrup, a gentle pat on the back, and the child would settle into a drowsy, manageable state. The dark humor is obvious. Victorian families celebrated moral fortitude and self-discipline, yet quietly sedated their children with a highly addictive chemical, ensuring compliance at the cost of consciousness. Adults, too, relied heavily on laudanum. It was prescribed for anxiety, exhaustion, overwork, or emotional distress, a kind of domestic pacifier for the restless, the worried, and the socially conscientious. Housewives might administer it to themselves after a day of endless chores, husbands after long hours at the office, and anyone suffering from insomnia at night. Its effects were subtle: calmness, gentle sedation, relief from pain or mental unrest. Yet beneath the surface lurked a quiet risk. Repeated use could foster dependency, alter mood, and blur the lines between relief and indulgence. Laudanum's presence was particularly notable in literary and artistic circles. Writers, poets, and intellectuals experimented with it to manage anxiety, stimulate creativity, or escape the pressures of daily life. Unlike the more overt highs of cocaine or strychnine, laudanum's effects were slow, creeping, and introspective. It offered a gentle detachment from reality, a softening of emotional intensity, and an altered perception of time and sensation. In private, it became a tool for reflection, imagination, and sometimes quiet rebellion against the rigid moral codes of the era. The social perception of laudanum was complex. On one hand, it was widely accepted and even celebrated as a medical necessity. On the other, its addictive potential was increasingly acknowledged. Newspapers and medical journals warned of caution, yet its integration into daily life remained seamless. Families, professionals, and medical practitioners collectively embraced its utility, often without fully considering the long-term consequences. Its omnipresence created a paradox, a substance that was both ordinary and extraordinary, comforting and dangerous, socially sanctioned and quietly subversive. Children's exposure to laudanum was perhaps the most striking illustration of Victorian attitudes toward chemicals. Parents trusted in the authority of physicians and pharmacists, administering drops for colic, teething pain, or sleeplessness. The effects were immediate. a quieter, more manageable child, easier to feed, bathe, or console. Yet each dose carried the potential for subtle dependency, mood alteration, or even overdose. The tragedy, when viewed through a modern lens, is palpable. The very behaviors celebrated as evidence of parental care, patience, attention, and domestic competence, were often chemically assisted, creating a quiet, ethical, and moral tension. For adults, laudanum was equally seductive. Its analgesic and calming effects made it invaluable in a society obsessed with productivity, propriety, and composure. Long hours of work, domestic obligations, and social expectation created widespread tension and fatigue, and laudanum offered an elegant solution: relief without social stigma, sedation without disgrace. Yet the line between therapeutic use and indulgence was thin, and many individuals crossed it unknowingly. The domestic administration of opium-based chemicals illustrates a broader Victorian comfort with chemical mediation, a willingness to trade control for temporary ease. Laudanum's influence extended into medicine, culture, and literature. Medical texts described careful dosing, emphasizing caution, yet also highlighting its versatility and efficacy. Authors used laudanum in novels and essays to convey moral weakness, emotional fragility, or altered perception, embedding the substance into cultural consciousness. It was both a narrative device and a lived experience, shaping understanding of emotion, health, and societal norms. Its subtlety made it particularly effective. It could alter mood, perception, and even social behavior without overt spectacle, a chemical thread running through domestic, social, and literary life. The Victorian approach to laudanum was emblematic of broader societal contradictions. Families celebrated self-discipline while secretly sedating children. Professionals praised moral fortitude while depending on chemical relief. Society admired propriety while tolerating private indulgence. Laudanum embodied the tension between appearance and reality, control and dependence, medical authority, and human curiosity. It was not merely a medicine. It was a reflection of cultural values, anxieties, and priorities, revealing the delicate balance between trust, risk, and desire. Its use in hospitals, too, highlighted these contradictions. Patients undergoing surgery, women in labor, or individuals recovering from illness relied on laudanum for comfort and pain relief. Its effects were predictable, controllable in skilled hands, yet inherently risky. Physicians weighed dosage against age, weight, and condition, conscious of the fine line between relief and harm. The chemical became an instrument of both care and subtle authority, illustrating the Victorian belief in mastery over the body through both skill and chemistry. By the end of the century, laudanum had cemented its place as a central feature of Victorian chemical culture. It was domestic and professional, therapeutic and recreational, celebrated and feared. Its effects shaped behavior, perception, and social interaction, quietly influencing households, workplaces, and literary imagination. In its use, Victorians navigated trust, authority, and desire, balancing relief and risk in a society simultaneously fascinated and constrained by chemicals. Ultimately, laudanum exemplifies the essence of Victorian drug culture: subtle, pervasive, morally complex, and intimately tied to daily life. It was a chemical companion in sickness, work, and domestic management, a tool for creativity, relief, and social performance, and a silent testament to society's curiosity, risk tolerance, and pragmatic indulgence. Each drop carried both promise and peril, reflecting the era's intricate dance between authority, experimentation, and the quiet seductions of chemistry. And in that delicate balance, laudanum stands as a symbol of an era that valued control yet relied on chemicals, that celebrated morality while administering sedatives, and that navigated the fine line between relief, dependence, and cultural expectation with a careful, practiced hand. In every Victorian household, laudanum was ordinary and extraordinary, mundane and magical, safe and dangerous, a chemical lens through which one can glimpse the contradictions, anxieties, and indulgences of the time. The Victorian obsession with exotic remedies and chemical curiosities extended far beyond laudanum, chloroform, or strychnine. Enter the world of cocaine, that beguiling stimulant that promised clarity, energy, and, for the upper and middle classes, a socially acceptable thrill. Unlike laudanum, which lulled its users into calm sedation, cocaine jolted the senses, sharpened focus, and offered a fleeting sense of invincibility. It was, in many ways, the mirror opposite of opium, active where opium was passive, exhilarating where opium was tranquil, an unmistakable signature of an era fascinated by the extremes of chemical experience. Cocaine first gained attention in the 1880s, marketed as a cure-all in tonics, lozenges, and even toothache drops. It was praised for its ability to stimulate the nervous system, counter fatigue, and even alleviate depression. Apothecaries touted its power with scientific-sounding authority, and Victorian families embraced it with the same unquestioning trust that had greeted laudanum, strychnine, or chloroform. A tiny dose could invigorate a tired clerk, calm a restless child in measured quantities, or even assist in managing minor ailments. Its effects were immediate, striking, and unmistakable, a chemical that commanded attention both socially and physiologically. The upper classes, ever attentive to fashion, health, and the appearance of sophistication, quickly adopted cocaine as a refined stimulant. A gentleman might discreetly enjoy a few drops in a tonic before a long day at the office, while a socialite might sip a cocaine-laced beverage to endure the endless obligations of society life. The novelty, prestige, and subtle thrill combined to make cocaine a socially sanctioned indulgence, a chemical enhancement that signaled both modernity and taste. Its use was both discreet and conspicuous, depending on circumstance, a private pleasure cloaked in the authority of medicine. Medical professionals initially celebrated cocaine as a marvel of modern science. Ophthalmologists used it as a local anesthetic, dentists recommended it for pain relief, and physicians prescribed it for fatigue, depression, or digestive weakness. Its versatility reinforced Victorian faith in chemical solutions to human problems, blending therapeutic potential with social and professional utility. And yet, as with other substances of the era, the boundary between medical benefit and personal indulgence was porous, leaving users vulnerable to dependency, overuse, or unanticipated psychological effects. Cocaine's cultural footprint extended into literature, journalism, and social commentary. Authors of the period referenced its use in salons, parlors, and workplaces, often illustrating both its utility and its dangers. Characters in novels might sip a tonic before a long night of writing or debate, while newspaper reports occasionally hinted at the social consequences of overindulgence, though often in sensationalized fashion. Cocaine became a symbol of both modernity and risk, a chemical emblem of Victorian curiosity, ambition, and willingness to flirt with danger within socially sanctioned boundaries. Working-class engagement with cocaine was more constrained but equally notable. While the upper and middle classes enjoyed tonics and patent medicines containing the substance, laborers or tradespeople might encounter it in small doses through cough syrups, patent medicines, or lozenges. The effects were practical: temporary alertness, increased endurance, or relief from minor discomforts. Yet, even in these contexts, cocaine's capacity for subtle dependency existed, reinforcing the pattern familiar across Victorian chemical culture: trusted, useful, yet quietly powerful. Children, though less frequently exposed than with laudanum or caffeine, occasionally encountered cocaine in medicinal preparations for teething pain, fatigue, or minor ailments. Parents trusted apothecaries and physicians, often unaware of the stimulant's potency or its psychological effects. The same society that quietly sedated children with opium-based remedies sometimes energized them with cocaine, revealing a curious duality. The same household could administer chemicals to both calm and stimulate, depending on need, temperament, or convenience. Cocaine's psychological effects were especially compelling. Users reported heightened awareness, energy, and confidence, a sense of temporary mastery over fatigue, anxiety, or emotional malaise. Yet these effects were ephemeral, demanding repeated doses to maintain performance or mood. The risk of dependency was real but subtle, unfolding gradually and often unnoticed until physical or psychological effects became undeniable. In Victorian society, where moderation, propriety, and composure were prized, cocaine offered a paradoxical chemical shortcut: energy, focus, and sociability without immediate moral or social penalty. The intersection of cocaine with other drugs adds another layer of complexity. Patent medicines often combined cocaine with alcohol, caffeine, or other stimulants, producing synergistic effects that could amplify energy, euphoria, or alertness. Families, professionals, and socialites integrated these tonics into daily routines with careful attention, or sometimes casual disregard, for dosage and timing. The chemical choreography became a subtle art form, orchestrated to optimize productivity, social grace, or domestic management, while masking the underlying risks of repeated stimulant use. Cocaine's rise also intersected with gender and class expectations. Women, in particular, could access it through tonics designed to treat fatigue, melancholy, or nervous disorders, socially acceptable ailments that provided an excuse for chemical intervention. Men relied on it to sustain labor, maintain alertness, or manage social obligations. In both cases, cocaine reinforced the Victorian desire for self-control and social performance, a chemical assistant to discipline, endurance, and refinement, even as it carried a hidden potential for indulgence and dependency. By the turn of the century, awareness of cocaine's addictive properties was emerging, yet it remained legally available, widely marketed, and culturally integrated. Society had not yet fully grasped the long-term consequences, treating it as a modern marvel rather than a potent chemical hazard. The trajectory of cocaine reflects the Victorian relationship with drugs: trust in authority, fascination with novelty, integration into domestic and professional life, and a curious mixture of optimism and risk. Ultimately, cocaine exemplifies the stimulant side of Victorian chemical culture: exhilarating, socially sanctioned, subtly addictive, and integrated into daily life. It offered energy, focus, and temporary liberation from fatigue or discomfort, yet carried invisible risks and demanded careful negotiation. In households, offices, salons, and literary circles, cocaine was a chemical companion, a reflection of ambition, curiosity, and the era's willingness to flirt with controlled danger. In the quiet hum of Victorian homes, amidst tea, laudanum, caffeine, and other tonics, cocaine added its own note, sharp, stimulating, and slightly dangerous. It was a substance of promise and paradox, illuminating the era's fascination with chemicals, the limits of self-control, and the allure of subtle, socially acceptable indulgence. Each dose, each tonic, and each carefully measured drop contributed to a culture in which pleasure, utility, and risk danced together, quietly shaping the rhythms of everyday life. Patent medicines were the Wild West of Victorian chemical culture, a space where science, marketing, and theatrical promise collided in equal measure. Walk into any apothecary, shop, or general store, and you would find shelves crammed with bottles, boxes, and tins, each promising to cure, invigorate, or enhance life in ways both miraculous and mysterious. The labels were bold, the claims audacious, and the ingredients a perplexing cocktail of opiates, alcohol, stimulants, and herbs. For the Victorian consumer, patent medicines were at once hope and hazard, miracle and menace, a chemical lottery dressed in persuasive prose and glossy packaging. These concoctions covered a dizzying array of ailments. There were tonics for nerves, elixirs for liver complaints, syrups for coughs, drops for teething, powders for digestive distress, and unguents for practically every imaginable malady. The appeal was universal. Whether one suffered from faintness, melancholy, fatigue, or chronic discomfort, there was a patented remedy promising relief in measured, convenient doses. And the magic of it all was that these medicines were legal, readily available, and socially acceptable. Victorian society, fascinated by chemistry, yet wary of scandal, embraced these elixirs with enthusiasm, tempered by trust in authority and advertising. Opium and its derivatives dominated the patent medicine landscape. Laudanum-based syrups promised to soothe nerves, alleviate pain, and calm children, while morphine-laced tonics targeted adults suffering from insomnia, anxiety, or exhaustion. These substances were presented as scientifically validated, morally neutral, and essential for maintaining health and composure in a demanding, often unforgiving society. The irony is obvious. An era obsessed with self-discipline, moral rectitude, and industriousness routinely relied on chemically induced compliance to maintain the very virtues it celebrated. Cocaine, strychnine, and even small doses of chloroform appeared in other patent medicines, offering stimulation, invigoration, or temporary euphoria. These combinations were not accidental. Manufacturers sought to create products that appealed to both the body and the imagination, promising transformation, relief, and subtle exhilaration. A single bottle might blend opiates with stimulants, alcohol with herbal infusions, caffeine with exotic roots, creating a domestic microcosm of Victorian chemical experimentation. Families, guided by advertising and medical authority, integrated these tonics into daily routines with almost ritual precision, measuring doses, timing administration, and quietly observing effects. The marketing of patent medicines was a study in psychological manipulation. Labels proclaimed miraculous results, exotic ingredients, and scientific sophistication. Testimonials from satisfied patients assured potential buyers that relief, energy, and wellness were just a teaspoon away. Elaborate illustrations depicted robust, happy families restored to vigor, while claims of global or royal endorsement lent credibility to otherwise dubious substances. The Victorian consumer, eager for improvement, subtly addicted to the idea of progress, and trusting of authority, fell into a pattern of consumption that was as much about hope as it was about chemistry. Patent medicines were especially popular among women and children. Mothers administered tonics for teething, fatigue, or colic, sometimes combining multiple remedies in a carefully orchestrated daily regimen. Housewives took them for nerves, exhaustion, or general debility, while working women relied on them for energy and stamina in physically demanding jobs. Children, often unknowingly, consumed syrups containing opiates or stimulants, experiencing subtle sedation, stimulation, or relief from discomfort. In each case, the promise of chemical intervention reinforced the Victorian belief in controlled, guided, and socially sanctioned use of substances. Yet the very ubiquity of these medicines created a paradox. Families, professionals, and individuals trusted in their authority while exposing themselves to substances that were sometimes dangerously concentrated. Overdose, dependency, and long-term health effects were real risks, yet largely hidden behind advertising, social acceptability, and the invisible nature of chemical action. The irony is dark. In an era obsessed with propriety and self-control, households routinely administered substances that could subtly undermine both. Patent medicines also reflected the social and economic hierarchies of the era. Wealthier households could afford imported, branded remedies, often advertised as premium or scientific, while working-class families relied on local or cheaper alternatives. Yet the chemical principles were often identical: small doses of opiates, stimulants, or alcohol, calibrated for efficacy and palatability. Consumption became a marker of both class and aspiration, a way to demonstrate care, sophistication, and engagement with modern science. The role of apothecaries and chemists was critical. They provided guidance, dispensed products, and sometimes participated in the creative blending of ingredients, acting as intermediaries between manufacturers, science, and domestic use. Yet, regulation was minimal, enforcement sporadic, and oversight inconsistent. This created a landscape in which trust, authority, and social expectation substituted for strict scientific verification, allowing families to integrate patent medicines into daily life with a combination of faith and experimentation. Public perception of patent medicines was complicated. Newspapers frequently warned of quackery, yet they also carried advertisements that reinforced consumption. Literature referenced these tonics with irony, satire, and cautionary tales, portraying both the allure and the risk of chemical intervention. Society simultaneously celebrated progress, condemned excess, and navigated the thin line between hope and hubris. In this environment, the patent medicine became a symbol of innovation, desire, risk, and the subtle pleasures of chemically assisted life. The Victorian relationship with patent medicines also highlights the era's broader engagement with drugs, an integration of chemistry, culture, and domestic routine that blurred boundaries between therapy, indulgence, and necessity. A family might combine tea, laudanum, strychnine tonics, and cocaine lozenges in a carefully orchestrated daily regimen, believing they were optimizing health, behavior, and mood. The choreography was intricate, subtle, and socially sanctioned, yet always tinged with the possibility of miscalculation, overuse, or unintended consequences. By the early 20th century, awareness of abuse, addiction, and public health risks began to grow, leading to emerging regulations, labeling requirements, and legal scrutiny. Yet the Victorian era had already established patterns, a domestic, social, and cultural acceptance of chemically mediated life, a belief in the power of tonics and elixirs, and a subtle thrill in experimenting with the limits of chemistry, authority, and human tolerance. Ultimately, patent medicines were emblematic of Victorian drug culture, audacious, inventive, socially integrated, and morally complex. They offered relief, stimulation, and hope while quietly demanding trust, discipline, and discretion. Every bottle, tin, and label contributed to a broader chemical ecosystem, shaping households, social life, and cultural imagination. In their promise, risk, and ubiquity, patent medicines reveal the paradox at the heart of Victorian chemical experience, a society obsessed with control, propriety, and moral authority, yet reliant on subtle, pervasive, and sometimes dangerously indulgent substances to navigate the demands of daily life. By the time the Victorian era drew to a close, the landscape of drugs and chemicals in daily life had become astonishingly intricate. Opium derivatives, stimulants, tonics, patent medicines, and mild sedatives formed a chemical ecosystem that was both domestic and social, medical and recreational. Each household, to varying degrees, navigated this web, orchestrating routines that balanced relief, stimulation, propriety, and curiosity. It was a world where the ordinary cup of tea might coexist with laudanum, strychnine, or cocaine, and where the line between medicine and indulgence was often imperceptibly thin. What makes this era particularly fascinating, and quietly dark, is the degree to which society embraced these substances as ordinary, almost invisible threads in daily life. Children, adults, the working class, and the wealthy all participated, albeit in different forms and concentrations. Families administered syrups and tonics with faith in authority and advertising, sometimes combining multiple substances in careful domestic choreography. Housewives, fathers, and physicians alike acted as chemists, social regulators, and moral guides, ensuring that doses, timing, and purpose aligned with perceived propriety. And yet, beneath the surface of order, subtle dependency, miscalculation, and experimentation were constant possibilities. Victorian drug culture reflects the era's obsession with control and its simultaneous fascination with novelty and risk. Substances like laudanum and chloroform promised calm or relief, but could subtly undermine agency. Stimulants like strychnine and cocaine offered energy and alertness, but carried hidden dangers. Caffeine was mundane, yet essential, a socially sanctioned crutch, while patent medicines combined multiple chemicals into single bottles of perceived miracle. The interplay of these substances illuminates a society striving to master life's challenges chemically, socially, and morally, often without fully comprehending the consequences. The domestic administration of drugs is particularly telling. Children were quietly medicated, whether to alleviate pain, soothe nerves, or bolster energy. Adults relied on stimulants and sedatives to meet social expectations, professional demands, or personal ambitions. Household routines, structured by meals, work, and ritual, often incorporated a chemical regimen that blended necessity with indulgence. In this context, the Victorian home becomes a laboratory of human behavior, a space where science, authority, and daily life converged in measured doses, careful observation, and subtle experimentation. Social and cultural acceptance of drugs further underscores the era's peculiar duality. Chemical intervention was embraced as a mark of sophistication, knowledge, and modernity. Literature, newspapers, and journals reinforced this perception, simultaneously celebrating progress and cautioning against excess. The public narrative framed substances as tools of improvement, symbols of civilized life, and markers of social and moral refinement. Yet, behind closed doors, these same chemicals facilitated escape, indulgence, and quiet rebellion against the strictures of Victorian propriety. The risks were omnipresent, though often invisible. Overdose, addiction, subtle dependency, and health consequences lurked in bottles, syrups, and tonics. Yet the culture of trust in physicians, pharmacists, and patent medicine manufacturers created a sense of safety that often belied reality. Families believed in moderation, in authority, and in chemical expertise, even as the very substances they relied upon demanded vigilance. This tension between perceived control and real danger defines much of Victorian drug culture, creating a world at once orderly, experimental, and inherently precarious. Cultural attitudes towards drugs were also gendered and class-conscious. Women, expected to manage households, raise children, and maintain moral virtue, were frequent consumers of tonics and sedatives, as were men expected to endure long hours of labor and social expectation. Upper-class households enjoyed the luxury of imported, branded remedies, while working-class families relied on local or cheaper alternatives. The chemical experience was thus stratified, yet pervasive, shaping behavior, perception, and social interaction across the spectrum of Victorian life. Medical authority played a dual role. It validated chemical use while imposing boundaries. Physicians prescribed laudanum for nerves, cocaine for fatigue, chloroform for childbirth, and strychnine for vitality. Yet, in doing so, they also reinforced trust in their expertise, the moral rightness of dosage, and the notion that chemistry could be managed safely in the hands of skilled practitioners. Families internalized this guidance, transforming domestic spaces into sites of chemical negotiation, experimentation, and control. The literary, artistic, and journalistic reflections of the era further cement the place of drugs in culture. Authors depicted tonics, elixirs, and chemical indulgences as symbols of modernity, sophistication, or moral tension. Newspapers sensationalized misuse while simultaneously advertising their miraculous benefits. Literature explored both the comfort and danger of chemical intervention, illustrating the delicate balance between relief and dependency, indulgence and propriety. In this way, drugs were both lived experience and cultural mirror, shaping and reflecting Victorian society's anxieties, desires, and contradictions. Ultimately, the story of Victorian drugs is a story of paradox. They were simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary, mundane and potent, morally neutral and ethically complex. They alleviated suffering, enhanced productivity, and facilitated social performance, yet also carried risk, subtle dependency, and potential harm. In their domestic, professional, and cultural integration, they reveal the essence of Victorian life, a civilization obsessed with control, propriety, and rationality, yet willing to flirt with chemical intervention to achieve comfort, performance, and pleasure. In every household, apothecary, and drawing room, substances like laudanum, chloroform, strychnine, caffeine, cocaine, and patent medicines quietly shaped behavior, perception, and social life. Families orchestrated doses, managed timing, and balanced multiple chemicals in an ongoing negotiation of control, necessity, and indulgence. The chemical fabric of Victorian existence was intricate, immersive, and morally complex, reflecting a society simultaneously disciplined, curious, and experimental. By examining the subtleties of drug use in Victorian times, one sees a civilization negotiating the thin line between mastery and indulgence, authority and experimentation, propriety and private desire. Each drop, each dose, and each carefully prepared tonic contributed to a domestic and cultural ecosystem that was both fascinating and quietly dangerous. Victorian life, in its chemical dimension, was a delicate dance between control and curiosity, a careful balancing act of hope, risk, and human ingenuity. As the century closed, the legacy of Victorian chemical culture endured. A society that had learned to integrate drugs seamlessly into daily life, that had celebrated innovation while tolerating subtle risk, and that had revealed, in quiet, pervasive ways, the profound interplay between authority, science, and human desire. The era's fascination with chemicals was not merely about health, stimulation, or relief. It was about the desire to master life itself, to control pain, fatigue, emotion, and behavior, all within the careful choreography of Victorian routine. In the end, Victorian drug use was a mirror of society itself, disciplined, curious, indulgent, cautious, experimental, and ever fascinated by the promise and peril of the substances that quietly shaped daily life. And in that reflection, one glimpses the complexity, humor, and darkly human ingenuity that defined an age obsessed with chemistry, control, and the art of living.